The next letter is G, and this letter goes below the baseline. So if I choose this as my baseline, header line, then we have a descending space. So we start again with this entrance stroke that we've seen in all of the letters so far, and we make an oval shape. Then we have a descending stem loop, and finish with another entrance stroke shape. Okay, so again, just like the previous videos, we're going to look at what direction we are writing. So the stroke goes upward, the oval again goes down and back up. This starts up here and we go down, come around and back up, and then leave with an upstroke. So the only spots where we have downstrokes are on the left side of the oval and on this descending stem loop. Okay, so putting that together, we have entrance stroke, oval, and then the descending stem loop. Now when we talked about this in the first video where we learned all these basic shapes, we looked at the descending stem loop, and you can either make it by starting with the right hand side and making a loop, leaving a gap, and then coming back in and adding the shade, or you can start here, come around, make a little bit narrower of a loop, and then add the shade on the right hand side. And when we make letters, you'll see that this way is a little bit easier to do, because then you can start immediately next to the oval when you make this downstroke, and you'll see when we add the shade why it's easier. Okay, so we come back around and make this thin loop, and then rather than adding the shade on the inside of this shape, we'll add it on the outside, which means we need to leave a little bit of a gap for the shading. Okay, so for the oval, we're adding the shade on the left-hand side on the inside of the oval. And then like we just talked about with this descending stem loop, we're going to add the shade on the outside of the shape. And when I'll write this again and I'll show you. So if we did make the descending stem loop the other way, we would have to start and leave a gap between the oval, come around, leave another gap, then come back in and add the shading on the left hand side. So you can see why this is a little bit easier than this way. Of course you can do it either way. It'll look the same in the end. Alright, now we can go back in. And you can shade in the thickness if you want. The next letter is H. And this will be the baseline, header line, and it goes above the header line, so we will have an ascending line. Again, we start with this entrance stroke that we started with a lot of times before. We have our ascending stem loop. Remember, we're going to leave a little bit of a gap right here. And then this is the first letter where we have our compound curve. So if you remember in the first video, we talked about how you can, following this purple line, you make the first hump of the curve wider than the second hump, so that when you add the shading back in, the space between them is equal. So then you get this space and this space is equal. Or if you're going to end up shading in the letters, you could just make it equal spacing and then add shade on the left and the right. So I usually make the first hump a little wider and then make the second hump a little narrower. And I'll show both ways when we write the letter. Okay, so again, we come up, start here, come up, around, and back down. And then on the compound curve, we go up, down, and up. So we only have two spots where there are shading. I'm going to leave a gap so that I can come back in with this shading. And then when we make the compound curve, so this is kind of like the exit stroke of the F, or part of the second variation of the B that we went over. When I add in, when I make the compound curve, I'm going to leave a little bit of a gap here. So I'm going to start a little bit to the right, the same point as here, because if we imagine that the shade is going to be right here, I want to start on the right side of the shade. And then I'm going to come up, make the first hump a little wider than the second one. Okay, that will help when I come back in with this shading. So now we have a gap right here and a gap right here. So we don't have this black line coming through the thickness, we have it starting on the right hand side. And then I'm going to add the shading on the inside of the H. Okay, so that's how you do it if you want to leave a gap. If you don't want to leave the gap and you want to fill it in, then you can, then it doesn't matter as much if you do leave the gap. So basically if you started this line closer, then you could just color over it. And same thing right here, if you did start the compound curve and make it, add the shading on the left and the right. So do you see how right now we have this line going through here, this line going through here, this line in the middle? If you wouldn't be able to leave it like this if you wanted to have a nice gap. But if you're coloring it in, again, it doesn't matter. Okay, so that's the H. This is the first letter that we're seeing that has this compound curve shape. Next we will go to I. I is pretty simple. We start again with this entrance stroke, and then we have an underturn shape, and then we'll draw a dot after we draw the I. So I'm just gonna draw a circle. Okay, so we start with this upstroke again, then we come down and back up. So here's our downstroke. Start with the entrance, then we make our underturn. So then we add the shade to the underturn on the downstroke on the inside of the shape. So right here. And then the dot, you just want to make it the same thickness and just right above that part of the eye. So this is a pretty simple letter. Again, we add thickness on the inside. And you can fill it in. Okay, now we have been doing 3 letters per video, but we're going to start doing 4 letters per video now that you understand the basics and you can figure out these shapes and where to add the shading, now that you understand the fundamentals of how faux calligraphy works. So the letter J is going to go below the baseline into the descending space. Again, we start off with this entrance stroke shape. Then we have a descending loop. Again, similar to the G, you can add the shade on the outside or the inside. When you're forming letters, usually it's easier to add on the outside. Starting with an upstroke, then we go down, around, and back up, finishing with an upstroke. And this part of the letter will be shaded. So I'm gonna shade on the outside of this loop. Oops. It's purple. And then make the exit stroke and the dot. And this is another reason why when you make this descending stem loop, I don't think I mentioned this on the G, but you want to keep these as two separate strokes. You want to keep this as the loop and then the exit, because if you made it all in one stroke, I'll show you what that would look like. So you could, if you wanted, start to the right and leave a gap, come around, and you should stop and leave a gap here to add the shading. Now I'm going to show you what would happen if you just made this all in one motion. So if this is all in one motion and then you go back in and add the shading, you get this line through here. So if you're coloring it in, again, it doesn't matter if you have that line, but keep that in mind if you want to keep the gap open. Alright, and there's the letter J. So here's G, H, I, and J, and in the next video we will cover the next 4 letters.